Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So, you know that I've been tracking what's happening with China for quite some time, especially with regards to what people are calling the final war, right? China's last-ditch effort to take over Taiwan and potentially try to bring down America in conjunction with Russia. I mean, it's a pretty scary, big picture, massive world change, but it's important to be following it. And so what's just happened in the past couple of days was that there was a speech given by Xi Jinping to some high-level communists where he's actively warning about something really foreboding in the immediate future. And you don't see language like this, especially coming from Xi Jinping, though they've been foreboding and they've been giving lots of warnings about potential conflict, etc. The way that he framed a lot of this in this recent message was frightening. Like something major is really happening, something significant is brewing in China right now. And so joining us today to help make sense of this has been my go-to guy for understanding what's happening, especially with the Communist Party in China, and that's Jeff Nyquist. So we're going to be digging into what's happening right now in China, what's happening with our southern border, China's influence over our politicians, over the cartels, the drug trade. So we're going to be diving into a lot of these really important issues for us to understand right now. As sitting here in America, we're watching our country just destroyed all around us. And I believe that a lot of it does go back to the efforts of the CCP. So it's really good for us to understand their role and what they think they're doing next. So before we get started, make sure you're following me on social media at Man in America, and also make sure you're listening to the show as a podcast as well. So if you want to listen, say you're working or driving, throw on the Man in America podcast in the background. Just go to your favorite podcast app and search for Man in America, and you'll find me there. All right, folks, let's jump into the interview with Jeff Nyquist. Jeff, it's great to have you back on. You haven't been here a little while, and I think a lot has happened. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you.
Well, thank you for having me, Seth.
Yeah, so I just want to jump right into the meat of the catalyst for me reaching out to you and saying, hey, can you come on and do a show? So I saw this was first reported by Josh Phillip over at the Epoch Times, but this article right here, so basically within the past couple of days, Xi Jinping made some statements that have a lot of people very alarmed. Now, I'll read through this a little bit. It says, prepare for worst case scenarios. Xi Jinping sounds national security alert. So I'll read a few things from this article here. It says, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called on his top national security officials to prepare for, quote, worst case scenarios and stormy seas as China faces increasingly difficult and complex internal and external threats. So he said again here, quote, we must adhere to bottom line thinking and worst case scenario thinking and get ready to undergo the major tests of high winds and rough waves and even perilous stormy seas. He added that more efforts were needed to modernize the nation's security architecture and, quote, get prepared for actual combat in dealing with practical problems. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I know that the Chinese, as far as my own research, oftentimes, especially the leaders, they speak in metaphors. They'll talk about a war through describing the bamboo, right? So when he's talking about the sea, getting ready for stormy seas, but then also saying that we have to prepare for actual combat, where, in your opinion, because I know you're following this stuff every day, what's this in line with? I mean, do you think that they're on the edge of something here? And I also do want to talk to you later in the show about the timings. I know we talked a lot about last November timing, but in terms of these recent statements, how are you making sense of this?
Well, the Chinese also have a metaphor, and the metaphor is two tigers cannot live on one mountain, right? And this is often repeated to show that there is going to be a showdown between China and the United States, the two tigers, and we cannot coexist. And this is something that is always before the eyes of the Chinese leaders. It is them or us. You find it in the secret speech of Chi Hao-chen, which was made about 20 years ago. He was the defense minister of China, who said that the plan was to use a biological weapon and attack America without us knowing it was coming from them and kill 100 to 200 million Americans. That was in his speech. And he said, look, we need to make a second China, and the lower 48 states is where we need to make it. And we've made a trade with Russia with land in the north to Russia to get this deal. And so to go back on Xi Jinping, the president of China, has made these kind of statements before, although this more recent one, it sounds more, in its metaphors, more immediate, more dire, right? He has said, get ready for war. I'll tell you, the military district, the Chinese one that faces Taiwan, in April, in the middle of the pandemic, when the pandemic was lighting us up in April of 2020, the newspaper publication of that military district said, "This is not a drill. We are getting ready for World War III. We're basically getting ready for war."
Folks, the world is going through a process that experts are calling de-dollarization, and China and Russia are leading the charge. So what's this mean? You see, the US dollar is a fiat currency, meaning it isn't backed by anything of value. The only thing that gives our dollar value is its demand around the world, which is primarily because of its petrodollar status, meaning that nations are forced to buy and sell oil in USD. But now, the world is losing faith in the dollar, and it's very close to losing its status as the petrodollar and world reserve currency, especially now that the oil-producing nations are abandoning the US for China, Russia, and other BRICS nations. But what happens if the dollar loses that sacred status? Well, the value of our dollars, our life savings, IRAs, 401ks, stocks, bank accounts, could literally be wiped out in a matter of months, weeks, or even overnight. And to make things worse, Biden and the Fed are currently working on a secret Project Hamilton, a new form of digital currency that will obliterate your freedom and privacy. Now look, folks, I'm not a financial advisor, so please do your own research. But I believe that now more than ever, it's a good time to consider transferring at least a portion of your wealth into physical gold and silver, real world assets that have survived every currency collapse and every empire collapse in history. But I want to be really clear with you. You don't buy gold and silver to get rich. You do it to protect and preserve your wealth and freedom. Look, there's a reason why nations like Russia are backing their currency with gold, and why the elites and banks are buying up physical gold and silver like we've never seen before. But they don't want you to know that. They want you to lose everything when the dollar crashes and be forced into their digital currency slave system. So now's the time to protect your financial future. And for this, I'm confident recommending Dr. Kirk Elliott. Kirk has 2 PhDs and is an incredible Christian patriot who's dedicated to helping protect your financial future. Look, Kirk is who I use. He's who my friends and my family use. I trust him. You can buy gold and silver directly, or you can transfer your IRA into physical gold and silver with zero taxes or penalties. So to learn more about this, open up a new tab right now and go to goldwithseth.com, or you can call 720-605-3900 to speak to someone right now. Again, that's 720-605-3900 or goldwithseth.com. The phone number and the link are also in the show description.
And these kind of alarms went through the Chinese military and were repeated in the Chinese media, repeated by, in January of 2021, Deng Xiaoping again says, we have to be ready for World War at any time. We have to get ready. We have to ready. Now, while this is going on, I received intelligence from people in the intelligence world that in Southeast Asia, intelligence from the communist countries there, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, that they were told by the Russians and the Chinese that certain sequence of events was coming that would lead to thunderous war against America. This is what the Vietnamese communists were told, for example. And to keep leadership cadre in bunkers, so always keep people underground in case the Americans realize it's the communist bloc, we're coming for them, and they try to nuke your leadership, because one of America's strategies in a war is to kill the leaders of the enemy countries to end it, because why slaughter the innocent people? Just kill them in their bunkers. So they wanted to put people in secret bunkers where the Americans wouldn't find them, so they couldn't kill the leaders where they normally were. That was one piece of intelligence. There was a Russian scientific source that was leaking like heck out of the top of Russia, saying things like China was proposing during the pandemic when this is first started. Now, what this pandemic was intended to be, what it was that was unleashed on us, we don't fully understand with the vaccines and everything. We don't understand what they were doing, the Chinese. But but what the intelligence was from this scientific source in Russia that China wanted to start World War III, that their economy had been disrupted by Trump, the last year of the Trump administration, Trump's trade policies. They knew they were going to hit the wall economically. Their banks were just a house of cards. China has I think they have one of the hugest debts per capita of any country in the world. They're massively indebted. They have they own a lot of American treasuries, but they have their own kind of crisis. And you see what's happened with Chinese real estate imploding. And this is, they're struggling. They knew they were struggling. And having gotten this big war machine, the biggest conventional war machine in the world, and they're making nuclear weapons like sausages. Now, it came out earlier this year that they've got the breeder reactor technology. The Russians gave it to them. They're mass producing nuclear warheads. They're mass producing missiles. They've got the missile silos laid out. So but they wanted to go. The word was the Chinese wanted to go sooner than later. But the Russians kept saying, "We're not ready. We're not ready." Well, you can see they're not. Even their invasion of Ukraine, they weren't ready, and the Chinese were pushing them. And this was, the Chinese wanted to start a war in late 2020 if they could. Russians by no means could do it. They even was talk about Iran starting something, but Iran was not going to sacrifice itself with a war in the Gulf. So there, the Chinese were like, we need to do something before we have this economic crisis. And of course, the pandemic just made it worse for China in many ways. So what ended up happening, and you've heard of the FSB papers that were published in France, that FSB people leaked stuff about this Chinese Russian collaboration, that China was trying to get Russia to go into a war in the Pacific with it. This is before they invaded Ukraine, saying, "Look, let's attack Japan together, and the United States. Let's defeat Japan and the United States together." And but it was the Russians again. No, we've got this problem with Ukraine. The Russians couldn't envision a war with the United States or Japan, even though they would be shoulder to shoulder with China. They would outnumber us. They would have better missiles and everything. Russia had these problems. What those problems were specifically that they had to fix, why it has to do with Ukraine, I think has to do with the fact that many of Russia's best missile engineering experts to run their strategic rocket forces, and a lot of their rocket forces stuff was outsourced to Ukraine before 2014. People don't realize that. And so when the Euromaidan revolution happened in 2014, the Russians lost part of what they were depending on for their military industrial complex. Ukrainians have just a high percentage of engineers of the Soviet Union and scientists and so forth. And this, in order to make these Russian rocket forces accurate and working, we're seeing how there's a lack of accuracy in the Russian rockets in the Ukraine war. That they're off target. They're not the precision weapons that, we talk about this, when we fought in the first Gulf War, how precision our weapons were. And we thought the Russians were right there with us. Well, either they never had it or they lost it when they lost Ukraine. Because Ukraine really was part of this complex of former Soviet countries before Yanukovych had to flee to Moscow, right? The president who was basically Putin's stooge in Kiev. So to understand the strategy of what they were doing, Russia said, "Look, we've got to fix the Ukraine thing first." So you will notice that days before the Ukraine war, Putin went to Beijing, right? Just as the Winter Olympics were happening in 2022, last year in February, he shows up in Beijing. They have these talks, and the joint statement in these talks is something to the effect of, Russia and China are the most powerful combination, meaning military combination, power combination since World War II. This is how they saw themselves informing. Now, they always had been. GRU Colonel Stanislav Lunev, for example, who I knew well and was a friend of mine, highest level defector from the the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, who worked in China, spoke fluent Mandarin, told me that at the end of the Cold War, Russia and China were like this, signing all these agreements to share intelligence, to jointly wage a future war against the United States, how to even divide up the territory of the United States, China getting the lower 48, Russia getting Alaska and parts of Canada. This kind of thing was worked out. So they've been working, Russia and China, with all the problems Russia had when it tried to liberalize and create a facade of a liberal democracy, that they had genuine collapses in Eastern Europe. They lost Poland basically in the period 2007 to 2013. There was a lot of the communist structures remained in all the former communist countries. Under the surface, they became social democrats. They won elections. It was the scandal. I think it was the year 2000. They found out that the prime minister of Hungary had been a secret police officer, right? And it became a scandal. He had to be investigated. They uncovered that Lech Walesa had been a stooge for the Polish communist secret police. You have Robert Bukharov's film on the Velvet Revolution showing the orders for the revolution came from Moscow. And he interviewed former STB officers saying, yeah, we got the orders from Moscow. I was the student who died there. They gave me an airplane ticket to Moscow to, afterwards. And that Vaclav Havel, Robert interviewed Vaclav Havel's bodyguards who said, the KGB came to meet with him and said, you're our guy. This kind of thing. So the changes in Eastern Europe weren't as advertised. You've got Andrew Codrescu, the Romanian American poet, the defector from Romania, who went to Romania when was one of the first people to get into communist Romania when Ceausescu was being overthrown, and discovered that the overthrow of Ceausescu was ordered from Moscow, that the people that engineered it were Romanian generals who had been agents of Moscow. So, this is an enormously complicated history. And it goes back to the defector, Anatoly Golitsyn, and to Jan Shena, who said they are preparing to collapse the Eastern Bloc, to collapse the Warsaw Pact alliance, said Shena. And Golitsyn wrote a whole book in 1984 saying they are going to collapse communism. And it's going to be a false liberalization. They're going to be in control all the time, and it's going to open the West up to massive infiltration, the movement of Soviet and KGB money into the West to buy up companies, and then they will be working with China to bring down the West. And he said, and Golitsyn was trying to warn people in his 1984 book, New Lies for Old. People can go there and read it. Dodd and Mead was the publisher, 1984. Mark Riebling of the Hudson Institute did a study of Golitsyn's book. He found 148 falsifiable predictions in Golitsyn's book, which by 1994, almost 94% of the predictions had come true. So this is not some conspiracy theory. It's actual history that's played out. It's actually proven to be there's something to it. And so when you look at the China, and one of the things Golitsyn predicted, by the way, is that at the final phase of the long-range strategy, China and Russia would come out as one clenched fist as allies to intimidate and just roll the West. And this was supposed to be it, what we are seeing here. Now, there was a Hong Kong businessman who, in speaking before the Committee on the Present Danger of China, he had many contacts in Beijing, and he had said, and this was 2 years ago last month, in 2021, and he said, look, the original plan was to do this attack on the West, the one clenched fist, in 2035. That's when the plan was. And he said, because their economy got derailed, whether it was Trump or just their own bungling, because they are communists, they don't understand economics. They're playing at capitalism. They're using state capitalism as a system to try to do everything they're doing. However that was, he said they need to go now. The Chinese are afraid. They have to go now. And their military balance is shifted because of Obama, what Obama did. And Trump wasn't able to correct it. They get rid of Trump, they can go up against Biden. So this is the background to this. And this statement by Xi Jinping shows that they're still on track. This is still what they want to do. That's what it shows. They have not been derailed from from actually taking the chance to go to war in the near term. And this takes us back to a year ago when you had the 57-minute recording of the military civil meeting in Guangdong that we are mobilizing for war basically against the United States. And this is what all the things we have to do. And because an order came down in April of 2022 from the Central Military Commission for China to get ready for war, to mobilize. Now, why was that mobilization? And their date was November 1st. They wanted to be ready. But there was no war after November 1st. It didn't happen. The mobilization was cooled. It was cooled down. Although, as the commander of Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, has said, we are seeing the biggest buildup in China, military buildup in the history of the world. So they're mobilizing, but it's like, all right, put the brakes on, because full mobilization is such an economic burden that you don't want to do it until you're actually going. And of course, the question is, why did they not go last November? Because they were still expecting in April for Russia to defeat Ukraine. And there's a principle that the communists follow. And it's a principle of the same thing in cataract surgery. You don't do both eyes at the same time. You operate on one eye, make sure it's good, then you operate on the other, because you don't want to blind anybody. Well, you got Russia and China. What happens when Russia attacked Ukraine? Sanctions, possibly even crippling. So how to get around sanctions? Well, China helps Russia get around sanctions. All those Chinese ships going up into the Arctic in the summer when it's warm, going into those Russian ports, carrying trade back and forth, building a new bridge across the Ussuri River, which they just did, a giant highway bridge. Just trying to help each other out commercially. You can't, if China went and helped. China is very much about denying they're helping Russia and Ukraine with weapons, but they are helping them economically. And why? Because China is being very careful not to get sanctioned. Because if they're both sanctioned at once, right, it's like being blind in both eyes. And that is, it was Galitzin who in his book, The Perestroika Deception in 1995, explained this principle, that they don't want to risk. And we often think about it, they go against Taiwan and Ukraine at the same time, and we don't have enough to do it. But they're also thinking about the economic sanctions we put on them, how crippling they are. And so, because by the time you get to late summer, by the time you get to September, and the Ukrainians are counterattacking, and they're capturing enormous amounts of Russian supplies and tanks and everything else in their impromptu counteroffensive, the Chinese are going, we cannot do this. We can't do whatever they were trying to do. And of course, they were mobilizing enormous numbers of ships. And what I was told when I interviewed Mr. Wang of Luda Media, he was saying, look, they're going to blockade Taiwan. They're not going to invade it. They're going to invade all these they're going to go past the second island chain, and that's like, oh my gosh, that's on the way to Hawaii, and there's was going to be a nuclear Pearl Harbor against our fleet. And that would imply more than just attacking ships with nuclear weapons. But we don't know the exact strategy. But we do know from the Chinese sources that they had the special code names they were giving for the surprise attack to each branch of service. And the nuclear missile forces in China had their code word for participating in the surprise attack. So we know there's some nuclear element envisioned. So this is, and of course there's they very much, the Russians especially, follow Clausewitz. I know the Chinese follow Sun Tzu, but Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means. Well, Lenin inverted that and said politics is war by other means. So they also have their low-level warfare, their attempts to diplomatically get what they want. They've been infiltrating the Solomon Islands, as you've no doubt heard. They've been pushing on the Philippines, which the Philippines now reacted. We're getting our bases back in the Philippines, which is really bad news for them, right? And then you have the G7 meeting, where Japan is like, come to Japan. We got this problem with China. Maybe we can extend NATO into the Pacific, And these are the Japanese. And of course, what happened last July? Abe, the great anti-communist Japanese politician, was assassinated, which backfired on the Chinese. We don't understand how this assassination, was it just some random goofy guy, or was there a Chinese hand in this? We don't know. But it definitely strengthened Japan. And we had elections in South Korea. So the leftist is gone in South Korea. So we have a strong South Korea again that's, going to be selling South Korean tanks to Poland. So there's now the Western alliance all around, there's a strengthening, a tightening against China and Russia. And Beijing Xiaoping, I mean, Xi Jinping is basically saying, look, we might end up in a war here. We might have to push out. And the one advantage, the Russian conventional military has failed. The Chinese military may have those same failings because it was created under Soviet China. It was Russian military advisors. It was built on the Russian model, military model. They may have the same, but you see this model, when you go back to Marshal Sokolovsky and Soviet military strategy, these forces were made to be used in conjunction with nuclear weapons. It's what people don't understand. That's why they're not so good at conventional war, because they never expected to fight a conventional war against a peer enemy without using nukes in that war. You read all the Soviet books from the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's like nuclear weapons are the decisive weapons. The tanks and everything else work in tandem with the nuclear weapons. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around it because it's not our conception. It's not the way we think of it. And the Chinese actually have that thinking. And you can tell by the way they've built their military.
And there's so much to unpack here, but when you're talking about some of the defector literature, especially back in the 80s, what kept coming to my mind was the interview with Yuri Bezmenov when he's talking about basically, even in the 80s, how prime the United States was for them to come in, for the communists to come in. And I think that if we fast forward to our country right now, because there's a lot of people that you'll talk to them, especially people that are following the more alternative news, they know that our country's in a dire situation, but the fingers almost always point towards the World Economic Forum or the UN. They oftentimes don't point to China or Russia. But if you look around and you look at everything that's happened in our country since they got Trump out of office, right? He wasn't elected out. They pulled him out. They used all their different methods and control to pull him out. You have people like Greg Phillips that was exposing that China was heavily behind what happened in the election in 2020. Like had like a significant hand in it. But then you look at just what's happened since they put Joe Biden in, a complete weakening, a gutting of our military, which I think in a lot of ways that Joe Biden has been working with the Chinese to weaken America, because maybe he gets a prime spot in the future, one world order under China. Because if you look at the gutting of the military with the mandates, if you look at us just sending everything over to Ukraine, kind of gutting our own supplies, sending them off, to me, that would be one of the perfect strategies for China is to say, hey, let's empty out their coffers, get them to send everything to Ukraine. That way, when we come to them, like they don't have their missile weapon systems and all the different things that they would need to defend an attack. But then even if you look at what's happening across America with the trans movement, or the woke companies, or like this is cultural warfare. I mean, I had Shi Van Fleet on recently, who was someone that lived under Mao in the Cultural Revolution. She says, look, America is undergoing a cultural revolution. It's just that most Americans don't know it. And so, for me, if I take a step back, and of course I see that there are people like, Klaus Schwab and whatnot, they've got their hand in a lot of things, but so many of these roads lead straight back to the CCP. And when you then look at the fact that, as you mentioned, their weaknesses economically, their money printing, I mean, yes, our financial system is a train wreck, but if ours is a train wreck, theirs is like a shuttle failure to launch blowing up in the sky. I mean, it's a major problem over there. If you look at all the unrest that they're having in their own country, you look at what happened, with COVID, something, again, from a lot of the sources that I have and following a lot of the Epoch Times reporting, something significant backfired on them and they lost a large amount of lives over there. So what I see as I piece this all together is that, you have Agenda 2030 coming from the European globalists. You have what you're talking about, China's plan of, China 2035 being the one world government basically, and kind of owning everything. And Trump in both cases, I think derailing and really delaying, not delaying, but really messing up a lot of those plans and forcing them to accelerate their plans, which is making them get sloppy. And so when I piece all that together, it makes sense that China and Xi Jinping, they're in a place where they're like a rattlesnake backed into the corner near death. And the only option is to fight with everything that they have because they're on the brink of collapse. I mean, is my assessment in line with how you're seeing things?
Well, remember that communism is a global movement, a world movement, and that most of the people in the communist movement are communists. They don't even understand what it's about. The communists, the Leninists, the Marxist Leninists are very disciplined. They have disciplined organization. They have absolute loyalty and obedience, and they have a very good organization and methods. And so they have dominated the left. What they have also worked towards since 1970 is to create a sort of right-wing Marxism. Like Lyndon LaRouche tried to create a right-wing Marxist party, the U.S. Labor Party, in 1971. That failed, but from what he learned there, he created the LaRoucheite movement, right? LaRouche would go to Moscow and give sort of secret lectures to groups from the Soviet Central Committee. But to the thing about the so-called globalists is it's just the infiltration of the West by communism. And the end of the strategy is something called convergence, where when they have weakened the West to a point where they can force everything, they force it on Sino-Soviet or Russian-Chinese terms. They force the convergence and the unity of the globe on their terms. And then you have a global totalitarian state. Now, it's very interesting what we may be seeing here, but there are two kinds of communists in this world system: the Western communists and the Eastern ones. And notice the Western communists are supposed to disarm their countries.
I've got a quick message for you. I have one simple question. If today you could no longer go purchase more food for your family with the food stores that you have in your home, how long would you be able to feed your family? Would it be a week, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, a year? This is a really important question, folks, that we have to be very realistic about, because the elites are proactively trying to put us into a state of food crisis and a state of famine. I'm sure you've seen all of the different food processing plants and farms that are blowing up. You've got cattle dying by the tens of thousands. They're proactively trying to collapse our food system because they know if they can control our food, they can control us. And so one of the best ways to be outside of their control is to be able to have our own stores of food and to be able to produce our own food. So there's really two things I would recommend. One is having heirloom seeds that you can grow your own food with, making sure that they're non-GMO heirloom seeds, that way you can harvest your seeds this year, use them next year. You can use these seeds for generations. Literally, that's how it will work. The other thing, though, is this high quality storable food. This is food that's sitting somewhere. It's hidden in your basement, buried in your backyard, whatever it is. So that way, if there is a crisis, if there is an emergency, you might have 3 months set aside to get through that time period. And so for this, I would highly recommend a company called Heaven's Harvest. This is an amazing Christian-owned patriot company. And what they're doing is they're making high quality storable food. Again, a lot of the food companies, they say these food buckets, they're all about maximizing calories per dollar. They're filling the buckets with a bunch of filler and junk like sweet beverages, etc. But Heaven's Harvest, they focus on very high quality food that will last up to 25 years on the shelf. They also sell heirloom seeds. So you can buy all of your seeds, you can buy all of your storable food. And look, folks, personally, I would recommend having at least 3 months per person in your household, if not 6 months or even a year. Again, depends on your budget, but I would definitely make sure you have some seeds, because those seeds could be worth their weight in gold, if not more, in the future. So to go ahead and do this right now, go open up a new tab and go to heavensharvest.com. And if you use the promo code Seth, that's SETH, promo code Seth, you'll save 15% off of your entire order. So again, folks, the time is running out and you'd rather be 3 months or 1 year early than 1 day late. Again, heavensharvest.com and use promo code Seth to save 15% today.
Obama was for zero option, get rid of all the nuclear weapons. I've heard experts call Biden the most anti-nuclear weapon president we've ever had. You have also the leaders in Europe who won't build their militaries. In Germany, in France, they just let everything go to rot, right? So in the US military, this is what, when the left gets power, they want to gut the military. They want more social programs so that then you can't even find the money then later to finance the military because you've taken so much you've addicted people to getting the freebies from the government. This is all conscious strategy. So just think about this for a minute. Two kinds of communists. Oh yeah, we're making utopia. We're making communism in the West. We're getting rid of all the reactionaries. We have to get rid of our nuclear weapons and imperialism. And in the East, they're massively building nuclear weapons and military as fast as they can. And maybe at some point, some of these people in the communist movement who aren't communists, but who are in influential position, are looking around. We don't have any weapons. They're all built up. They're invading countries like Ukraine or Georgia or Tibet. They're persecuting the Uyghurs in Western China. And so what are we doing here? And so they're not able to get the total surrender of the West. They haven't been able to get rid of NATO. They haven't been able to make their deception work to where we would totally disarm. Although we haven't built a new nuclear warhead now since 1992, we haven't even tested one since September of 92. There is later this year, because of the scare that people have gotten from the way China acted when Biden first came in. Remember the Alaska meeting? You're going to take dictation from us. Basically, the administration was like, some of these people were in shock. These people are going to dictate to us. And these are American leftists who are going, what is this? So you got a wake-up call as well, maybe you're an American. Maybe you think you're a leftist. Maybe you realize these people are out to get you. And you're waking up a little bit. And so by the end of this year, we're going to start having at least the production of tactical nuclear weapons in the US by the end of the year, which is a tremendous relief if we can get there, right? If they don't think, oh, well, we better nuke them right now before they get them. There are people who think, the people who are experts who think our nuclear arsenal doesn't work. You're going to get an argument one way or I don't know what the answer is because we've only had virtual testing, right? But this is the big problem that Russia and China have. I think I've tangled this up in the wrong way. This is the problem that you have with this present scenario. Can the Russians and Chinese go nuclear and turn the tables, or is it too late? Have they, messed up so bad that they have to run back, pretend to liberalize, pretend to be the nice Chinese friendly partner, trading partner of the US, or Vladimir Putin is removed and they do a new perestroika in Russia to try to save their structures again. Now in Russia, they're not likely to do that because when they tried this fake liberalization, they ended up with some genuine liberalization, which basically disabled parts of their system, and they lost countries like the Baltic states and Poland and Georgia and Ukraine. And this is what ended up in this. It's basically a civil war within the old Soviet state. And you've got, even in Russia, you've maybe listened to Konstantin in Tashkent. He's a Russian economist from Rostov who fled Russia at the beginning of the war. And he's been broadcasting about what's really going on with the economy in the war and what's going on with the mood of the Russian people. And he says 3 million Russians have left Russia. And they're wondering, what do we do? And he's organizing them in Tashkent. Now, that's still maybe a dangerous place to be if the communists come back in force there. But there is throughout Russia this problem. They could not bring the communist system back because what they found out, and this was a KGB guy who worked in the Kremlin under Boris Yeltsin. He said, oh yeah, the Kremlin was this giant KGB operation under Kremlin. And we were trying to find out under the late Soviet period, what did the Soviet citizen think? What did the party member think? And what they found out was they all hated the system. They hated Marxist Leninist, ideology, or it's not an ideology, it's a philosophy, or it's a worldview, or it's a system of thought that Marx had created, because you can't say it's an ideology because ideology is nonsense, right? And they won't admit it's nonsense. They say it's science. So they couldn't bring it back. So they had to improvise this kind of Putinistic regime where Putin pretends to be a Russian nationalist and a Christian even, which he is not. You just watch, you look at the Cuban government. Putin sent 25 million tons of grain to Cuba this year. He sent, I think it was 21 million grains last year, million tons. And the Cuban communist government gave thanks to Russia because, there's a grain shortage in the world. And he wanted to make sure Cuba was fed. Why? Cuba's a communist country. Why are the Russians building military infrastructure in communist Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega? Why are there Russian anti-aircraft troops in Caracas, where there are also Chinese anti-aircraft troops defending the communist regime in Venezuela? Well, guess what? It's a communist bloc and Russia's part of it. They've been pretending. And so when you see Xi and Putin together, they always were. But it's one clenched fist. They're trying to make the one clenched fist work. And the West, rather than folding, Macron, he wanted to fold. You saw he went to Beijing and he came back. We don't want to fight America's wars. It's like, shut up and sit down, Mr. Macron. They weren't going for it. They're trying to undermine Germany, to get Germany to flip. France might flip if Macron could get enough of a reason to do it. But they're trying to destroy NATO even now. And because then Russia will own Europe. And then one eye will be fixed in the cataract surgery. Then they can go to the Pacific, the other eye, and they can go against America and Japan. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. It does. And what also, again, when I piece it all together, when I look at what's happening on the southern border, I mean, to me, this is, again, it's a massive example of something that goes straight back to China. And I'll pull up an article here. So this is from a little bit ago, earlier this year, from New York Post, where they're saying that the number of Chinese migrants caught at the southern border skyrockets over 700%. We've got people like Michael Yan, a good friend that's down there, and it's been giving me a lot of reports on it, saying that he's seeing so many Chinese. He's talking to them, but these aren't women and children. These are fighting aged men. And so, again, going back to, okay, we know the Biden family has an incredible financial history with the CCP, bribes and business dealings. I mean, it goes so deep.
And with Russia, too.
Well, there you go. Yeah, there you go.
The mayor of Moscow's wife.
Exactly. And even Hillary has strong ties to Russia, as much as they want to blame Trump. Like the people that we look at and say, oh, yeah, these are the bad people. Well, they're also in bed with the Chinese and the Russians. Right.
Well, that's part of the deception. They don't want to be caught because they'll all be hanged. If we realize they have been stooges of Moscow and Beijing all these many years, which includes the Clintons, includes Obama, includes Biden, many other, John Kerry, they've been stooges of the communist system for almost all their adult life, and you go back, you look at their record, and it's very clear. Biden, you go to the Bukovsky files. Vladimir Bukovsky him and Pavel Stroilev stole something like 80,000, Communist Party documents out of the former Soviet Union archives. And one of those documents is about Joe Biden leading a Senate delegation to Moscow in 1979, telling the Russians, look, I'm not your enemy. I'm not against you. I have to say things against you for public consumption back home, but I'm your friend. And this is a secret document of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union saying this is what Biden is telling us. He's really our guy. And Bukovsky wrote an article, I think it was published on Breitbart, in which he said, look, this man is an agent of influence of the Soviet Union, Senator Joseph Biden. And at the time, he was vice president under Obama. You've got Obama being mentored you've got this book, which I wrote a chapter in about this, that bless his heart, Jamie Glazow put together so many interesting things. This book is Barack Obama's True Legacy. And the first chapter starts with a guy who went to college with Barack Obama and said Barack Obama was a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary when he knew him at Occidental. And so what was the first country that former President Obama visited when he left office? China. Right? So, and of course, I examined his Russian reset policy. All these people were helping Russia Then in 2012, there's this strange meeting between Hillary Clinton and Sergei Lavrov, where she's leading a delegation to St. Petersburg, and he takes her into this little side room where they disappear for 2 hours, and there's no translator. There's no American witnesses. It's just Sergei Lavrov and Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State and the Russian foreign minister. 2 hours. She would never say what they spoke about in it. Michael McFaul, the American ambassador to Russia, said something very disturbing happened in that meeting. She was disturbed by. But from that point on, Sergei Lavrov and Hillary Clinton started to bicker. And Lavrov, at the dinner right after the meeting, he starts picking on the different American officials there, saying that Ambassador McFaul is not being diplomatic, that Hillary Clinton's press assistant is basically the minister of disinformation, that the Americans have taken these wrong positions, that they've been against Russia. So all of a sudden there's this about face, and it starts, and it's like it's a collaboration between the Clinton administration people and the Russians to convert within about a year's time the Democratic Party from a pro-Russia to an anti-Russia party, and then to name Trump and the Republicans as the Russian puppets, to put the shoe on the other foot. And this is ingenious. And I believe that the initiative came from the Russians. And you had the exact same thing when John Kerry became Secretary of State in 2013, when Hillary left office. And she left office with words against Russia coming out of her mouth. Kerry goes to Moscow, talks to Putin, then spends again 2 hours alone, no translator, with Sergei Lavrov. What is in this conversation? You are going to be our enemy now. You have to do this to protect you. Why? Because in March of 2012, Obama was caught on a hot mic being obsequious to Russian President Medvedev, saying, leaning over, holding gently Medvedev's wrist in a very intimate embrace, saying, I need to get elected one more time, and then I can be flexible. Tell Vladimir. And then in English, mind you, the Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, saying, I understand. I will tell Vladimir. Right? And that was caught. You can go on YouTube and you can watch that over and over again right now, because I've watched it dozens and dozens of times. It's like, what is that? So it's just 2.5 months later in St. Petersburg, Hillary Clinton, June of 2012, she's in this, I think it was the end of June, she gets this secret meeting with Lavrov, and nobody knows what it was about. But it was from that moment on, they started to bicker publicly to make it into, and it was over Syria, supposedly the line in the sand in Syria. And why were we supporting jihadists in Syria against Assad? What was that all about? Why were we butting heads with Russia over this? The whole thing is so convoluted and Asiatic in the intrigue involved. But I believe there's something there.
And so, and that's, I guess that's one thing just to remind ourselves of, is that of all the different people and groups, the communists they're masters of deception. And I really believe it's like, okay, who is the master of deception? In my opinion, it's Satan. He is the grand deceiver. He's the father of lies. And when I look at communism, trace back Marx and his deals with Satan, to me, the whole party is just the political branch of Satan. And so it is all about lies and delusion and just deep infiltration and psychological operations built upon psychological operations, and creating so much confusion and chaos that here we are in America, and everyone says like, okay, well, who's the enemy? It's like, what's my neighbor with the Joe Biden sign? Or who's your enemy? It's like, it's the American patriot. Those Trump supporters. We're so mixed up and confused that we're ripe for the taking. But then if you then look at what's happening at the southern border as just a further extension of that, I know that you've talked a lot about the southern border and the Chinese control of the southern border, the Chinese involvement with the cartels. And so kind of like transitioning to that a little bit, what do you see happening down there? I mean, do you think that the speech that Xi Jinping gave, so, okay, we're entering into the stormy phase, we're entering into the very difficult period. It's also the exact same time that we're seeing a massive ramp in Chinese nationals flooding into our country with the border opened up by the communist plants in the White House. So how do you see all that fitting together, especially with these fighting age males coming in?
Yeah, well, I think I've mentioned Scott Gulbranson's work, the
The
Silent
journalist,
Invasion.
right?
Gulbranson, right, the journalist who went down there, he got a Tijuana policeman to show him around. This Tijuana policeman had related to him that he had been tasked by his boss of delivering supplies to a secret commando encampment in the desert in northern Mexico of Chinese, Cuban, and Russian commando troops in this encampment, and that they had in the tents maps of the borderlands, maps of the border crossings, all of this, and that they had their military equipment and markings were like made to look like Mexican military equipment and markings. And this was totally handled through. Look, it's very important, the drug trafficking element of this, to understand the getting into Mexico, and it's also true in Canada. It's not just Mexico they've infiltrated. The Chinese are in Canada. And I mentioned the Sidewinder Report, 1997, a joint study of the Canadian uh, uh, Royal Mounted Police and the CIS, the Canadian Intelligence Service, saying that the Chinese, through organized crime, through the triads, are infiltrating Canada. They're laundering money for political use through real estate in Canada to elect politicians, to bribe officials. And you look at the accusations in Arizona about election fraud in Arizona, that it's the Sinaloa cartel, it's being alleged, is behind the bribing of officials and the falsifying of election results in Arizona. And that then there's been, that very controversial testimony before a committee of the joint session of the legislature of Arizona, given this, which caused one of the members to be ejected from the legislature for bringing that forward, right? But the truth of the matter is in the beginning of the 1950s, Mao Zedong wanted to do a opium war on the West. And when Khrushchev got in, he said, this is a fabulous idea. We can do this really good. Let's do studies. So in the mid-50s, the Soviet Union did studies on organized crime, drug trafficking, the rest of it. And they realized, look, organized crime is a tremendous source of political intelligence, blackmail, and potential bribery of politicians, police, intelligence officials at every level. If we can get into organized crime, and there's a book on this by Joseph D. Douglas Jr. called Red Cocaine. It's absolutely brilliant. And it uses, again, defector testimony. Defectors who knew about this Operation Friendship of Nations that was being conducted. And of course, it's the Chinese and Russians were doing this at the same time. They both agreed to do this. So that by the time you get to the late 80s, Russia and China are controlling 2/3 of the world's drug trade through their syndicates that they have set up. And of course, they started out with marijuana and heroin, and they progressed after they did studies on American POWs and found cocaine was the perfect drug for Americans. So they got involved. They started to set up the cocaine trafficking networks, and they used the Colombian guerrillas and others in Latin America to set up those. And the Cubans were very active in this drug trafficking thing. And they wanted to use black street gangs in America because they wanted radical blacks to be brought in to the revolution. So it was going to finance the revolution, but it was also going to corrupt American society, not just in the sense of people using drugs becoming corrupted, but when you run this amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars through the banks, you end up owning the banks, corrupting the banking officials, and then you can corrupt the politicians by elections, right? And by election officials, which is what is being alleged. And the Sinaloa cartel, the thing about the Mexican cartels is, if you read the Los Angeles Times, which has had some of the best reporting on the Mexican mafia, is that It's the Mexican mafia is a junior mafia under the Russian mafia. And the Chinese are in Mexico too. They flooded Mexico more recently, but they've always been there as Scott Gilbranson, bringing weapons and narcotics into Mexico at the same time. And we don't know what kind of military. You hear the stories about Soviet era and Chinese military equipment stashed in Mexico. You hear about the communists in the Mexican government. Look at the Partido de Revolucionario Institucional, formerly the long governing ruling party, was taken over by the communists through its education system. They got into education in Mexico, and then they went. Of course, Mexico was a left-wing government anyway. It was very easy to draw them in. Then when they broke the back of that party, you've got the current president of Mexico has a history with the communists. So they've really moved into Mexico, and in this porous border, having this open border, which Biden has made happen, and the Marxists in the U.S. government have made happen. This is treason. This is collaboration with the enemy. And I'm sure many of these people are going, if they understood their neck was on the line, that America would go down, how many people were going to die, they might reconsider their allegiance, right, to their ideology, because they're Americans at the end of the day. And it's about, as General Chiao Chen says, it's sad, it's tragic, but we want to exterminate all the people in the lower 48 states. And he said, maybe even the Chinese Americans, because they are Americanized, and we can't do anything with them. We may not be able to make them communist Chinese. So, but anyway, why this infiltration? Because they have ports in North America they can bring troops and equipment in Mexico. Ensenada is a port run by the Chinese. Today, it was run by them 20 years ago. What Scott Gilbranson alleges that he was shown by this Tijuana policeman and by fishermen, Mexican fishermen, was they were bringing weapons in 20 years ago and stockpiling them in Mexico, smuggling them across the U.S. border, and making weapons caches here in the U.S. for the revolution, Like in the communist camps where the young red diaper babies went, they sang a song. Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping, bourgeoisie? Bourgeoisie. When the revolution comes, we'll kill you all with knives and guns, right? They taught little would-be communist kids that in the little communist camps here in the USA. This is not, I didn't make it up, right? You can go look this up. You can read, Louis Boudin's and Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley, the people who defected from the communist movement here in America. And when you talk about the World Economic Forum, it's just a communist front. Klaus Schwab has a bust of Lenin on his bookshelf. When he was interviewed one time, you could see it. Klaus Schwab went and gave the speech a year ago, this month in Beijing, to the World Festival of Youth and Students, the biggest communist youth organization in the world. Why is Klaus Schwab there speaking before communist youth? Why does he say communist China is the model he prefers? Klaus Schwab is a communist. He's not a globalist. That's just a mask, because everything's a false flag operation. If they came out and they tattooed a red star on a hammer and sickle on their forehead, everybody would run the other way. But they're here to save humanity. And they're not bad guys. They're not Nazis or communists, right? So it is deception, just like you say.
And so with all of this, kind of for people that really understand what's happening, it can be frightening and seeing this, because it's almost, I think about ignorance is bliss. It's like, gosh, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I knew very little about most of what we're talking about. Life was good. Life was just good. You go to the ballpark, you play, good little league, you get some popcorn, watch a movie. And I think that was part of the softening up, is making life just really comfortable here and making us feel like there's not an enemy at our doorstep. But for the people that are now aware of this and thinking, okay, what can I do? And what's for the average American patriot that understands what's happening, what can we do as Americans to help fight?
Well, the first thing you have to do is get oriented to the truth, to what's really going on, to who your enemy is. The first rule in politics is know who your friends are and know who your enemies are. If you can't get past that step, if you can't correctly identify your friends and enemies, you're done. And this is a problem we saw on the left. The left would not admit that China or Russia were our enemies during the Cold War. Now we've got this problem on the right as well as the left. We got people on the left who see imperialism, American imperialism, as the great threat to the world. And it just isn't so. If you understand China and Russia and Cuba and Venezuela, the aggressive, hateful animus, as you say, the Satanism of it, the destructionism of it. Karl Marx was into destroying. It just was in his mind, just rolling through him all the time. He wanted to overthrow and destroy the existing structures of civilization. And then he could be a god. As he said in a poem, he wrote a poem when he was in college. If he could destroy the world, if he could destroy humanity, he could walk godlike through the wreckage of the world because God had created the world, but he was equal to God if he could destroy the world. If you could just imagine that kind of mentality, that's Karl Marx in a nutshell. And so it is a kind of antichrist. Carl Jung said this in one of his last books. He says, communism, totalitarian communism, is the concentrated form of the antichrist movement in history that has been building. He argued it had been building from the 12th century with the Cathar and the Cathar heresy. The Albigensian Crusade was against that. That is the same, that basically the Gnostic Manichaean heresy that really said that the God of the Bible is the devil. So the devil, Lucifer, must be the good guy, right? So you have this inversion of the story of the religion or theology or philosophy of Western civilization is inverted. And that inversion signifies those who want to tear it all down and destroy it. And Marx is carrying this legacy into scientific socialism, which has prevailed in Cuba, China, Russia, Southeast Asia, and now in South America. Look at all the countries that have rolled over. Look at sub-Saharan Africa, mostly communist dominated. Some of the richest in terms of the mineral riches of those areas of the world. Venezuela is the most oil-rich country in Latin America, and it's communist controlled.
Yeah, it's I guess for me, when I look at this and when I tie it into the fact that, okay, I believe Satan's behind this, it's a good reminder that God's behind the other side, right? The side that I'm aligning myself with. And that's ultimately, that is what gives me hope, is I think that, whatever happens, even if my life comes to end, then I'm still in a great place. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like I feel bad for the atheists, like, well, what's going to happen to them? You know what I mean? In their perception. For me, it's like, if it's my time to go, then it's my time to go. And so that's how I've kind of formed my worldview. But I do think that, looking back at, even the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, is that, God was looking for a few good people to save, you know what I mean? Because, and it was worth it. If there's a few good people, and when I look around at me now, when I look at America, I look at, even around the world, I'd say there's a lot more than a few good people. And I think that this emergence of the evil we've seen in the past couple of years has really brought the evil out, but it's brought the good out as well. And that is what gives me hope, is I'm seeing so many people that, even if they didn't 5 years ago, now they're cherishing their family, they're cherishing God, they're cherishing traditional values, they're wanting to return back to those traditional values. I think ultimately that's what will end up, saving the good people in this world, that we should have hope, because I think that God will shine down upon us with those blessings if we're deserving of it. I think there's a massive movement to do that. So, oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
It's a divine chastisement. Yeah, it brings people closer to knowing what is true and right. And I think we're called upon to adhere to the truth, no matter how difficult that is, that our existence here is temporary after all. None of us leave this life alive. And so when you ask what people need to do, is basically to be correctly oriented, to know on what side you are. I mean, that's it. And then everything follows from that. What you need to do to prepare to get your family ready, and to be involved in local politics. Stop the communists in your school board. Stop them from indoctrinating your kids. Stop them in this county commissioners meeting or county supervisors meeting. Get involved. because we have to remove these people from positions of power. They cannot be allowed to subvert our system from positions of power in which they're just lying about what they're doing, like what we see in many state governments and state houses and in Washington.
Exactly, exactly. Well, Jeff, before we sign off, first off, just want to thank you for coming back on the show. I think it was a really, I mean, I always learn so much in talking to you. Just you're so well read. But I want to just give the audience your website, because there's also a wealth of knowledge here. It's just jrnyquist .blog. So it's jrnyquist.blog, where they can go check out your writings, and you're very active on there. And again, just want to thank you for being a voice out there. And I think ultimately trying to do what we've ended this episode with is trying to help orient people to the truth. And that's what I feel like fundamentally, I feel like that's like my job. That's my sole mission in life, is to try to help orient people to the truth. And I'm not going to pretend that I know the whole truth, but I'm trying my best to piece together what I think is true and bring on experts like yourself that I think have a very good grasp of what's happening in the world. So again, thank you, Jeff, for being here. It's great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Seth.
All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed that interview. But I have a quick question for you. Have you ever wondered, with all this banking nonsense, with these banks failing, the potential bail-ins, and what's happening with your bank? And that's the big question. Like, what's happening with your local bank, your local credit union? That's a big question to be asking right now. And so I've actually got a really special interview coming up with Dr. Kirk Elliott, where we're analyzing and showing you really easy tools that you can use that are free online to figure out exactly how healthy your bank is. You can use these tools to go on and look at your bank and see what their deposits are, see what their spreads are, what the risk is, what the rating is, how likely that bank is to fail or not. So I just think this is going to be such a useful and helpful interview with Dr. Kirk Elliott. So enjoy. So Kirk, it is great to have you back on as usual. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you, Seth?
Yeah, good. Just a lot going on, and so there's a lot to talk about too. But it's funny because as much as it seems like it's just a complete clown world, I feel like that I've been focused a lot more on just stuff around the house and family, and it's been a really nice break from kind of constantly following the news and seeing what's happening. And
Right.
It's important to, I think, pull out every once in a while from that.
It is. I mean, clown world, really a good description. I mean, what we've seen, if you look at the debt ceiling talks, it was political theater at its finest, right? I mean, so for 3 weeks, you've got McCarthy telling Biden, it's like, hey, this is mortgaging our kids' future. It's mortgaging America. We're not going to keep rewarding you for adding debt. There's no way we're going to do anything. And then Biden says, well, there's no way that we're not going to negotiate. It's so the stalemate, right? So then Biden goes to Japan to the G7 meetings because he's got more important things to do than figure out the destiny of America, right? So he goes to the G7 to talk about their globalist things. Then he comes back, last week, and they okay, so debt ceiling talks again. Now we better get it squared away. So what did they do? I mean, I'm not even joking. McCarthy might be the worst negotiator on the planet, or he was never negotiating at all. Because what we got, I mean, this is why I say it's political theater. They wanted us to think that they were fighting about all this stuff. But in reality, he gave Biden everything that he wanted. So, and more. I mean, literally, he gave him more than what he wanted, because prior to going into this, the talks were, okay, they're going to raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion, which would have been the largest ever. But what they did was worse. So they didn't raise the debt ceiling. They took the ceiling off, right? So unlimited spending until the election. So when you have the people in power that now have unlimited spending until the election, who does that benefit? It benefits the people in power, right? So it's like you just gave Biden like the get out of jail free card, right? It's like, what in the world? Unlimited spending until the election, and then they're going to defer talking about that until after the election, which means a lame duck Congress. people who may have been voted out are going to determine the spending future of America. This is insanity. But some of the things that they kept in there were the $78 billion to hire all the cajillions of IRS, new agents that are going to be armed. They kept that in there. They kept in there the potentially illegal, paying off of student debts from $500 billion to $1 trillion worth. That number is ambiguous. It's like, okay, that one might not even be lawful, right? They kept in there all this horrible stuff and then took off the ceiling part of the debt ceiling. It's like, oh, what? I mean, truly, you weren't even planning on having a debt ceiling negotiation talk, McCarthy. Seriously, worst thing that I've seen financially for America in a long time, which means what? And more inflation is going to come, more rate hikes are going to come. So again, avoid the political theater nonsense that they're talking about. Oh, we can possibly, halt the raising of interest rates for a while because we've got this debt under control. Look, this is like the era of the in the Reagan years when you had the contract with America that Newt Gingrich put together, and Democrats and Republicans were talking, cutting deals, and negotiating. I mean, that's what they're trying to make this sound like. So, except for the one big, huge fact, there was no negotiating being done. They forgot about the biggest word in the negotiating part of it. And they forgot about the other biggest word in debt ceiling, and they just took the word ceiling out. It's like, oh, I mean, this is really bad stuff, Seth, and yet this is what we've got.
It is. It's like giving a 16-year-old an Amex Black card with no limit and saying, be responsible, right? It's like before you know it, there's going to be Ferraris and, gosh, who knows what else. We won't get into that. But yeah. Something I wanted to hone in with you on is that obviously we've been talking a lot about just where's the dollar at, de-dollarization, but really, especially the past couple of months, the state of the banking industry, right? Is there a looming, collapse of the banking system? Should we be worried? And I think that sometimes we cover these issues, it's this big picture, right? Big picture numbers and big picture, perspective of what's happening, with the overall economy. But for someone that say has a local credit union or a local bank they're banking with, they're thinking, what about my bank, right? Because maybe they're not banking with JP Morgan Chase or some of the other big guys, but they're thinking still, again, and I see this question all the time, what about credit unions? What about small local banks? And I think that that's something that really matters to the average person so much, right? Your typical American, especially the listeners of this program, I think they're trying to go with more local, but then the concern is what's the health of those banks? And so there's something that, I think it's a really important topic. And I discovered something this week, which I'm really excited to talk to you about, which is a third-party company that helps analyze the health of the banking industry, like at a bank by bank level, like where you can literally look at your exact bank and see how they've independently rated it. Now, it's not like a Moody's or one of these big ratings companies that are being bought off by the banks to say, yeah, all those mortgages are great. Let's repackage them and sell them until the cows come home. This is a really specific, company. So I've got a quick video. So Glenn Beck interviewed, I think it was the COO, if I remember correctly, one of the main, chief officers at this company, and they're talking about this now. But before I play the video, though, I'm just going to read a quick snippet about the company because this helps you understand where they're at and what they're talking about with the banking system. So let me pull this article up. So this is. So it's called Weiss Ratings. So Weiss Ratings warns 4,243 U.S. banks and credit unions are vulnerable to failure. So this is significant. Now, I'm going to read a little bit of this, but I want to highlight this one point right here, which says since 2008, among the 539 banks that have failed, Weiss Ratings has provided advance warning on 535, or 99.3%. So this company that rates these banks and says, hey, look, these are vulnerable, they've got a 99.3% track record of looking at all the assets and the positions of a bank and understanding, are they close to failing? Are they vulnerable? I mean, that's almost 100% track record. So I'll read this to you real quickly. It says, Weiss Ratings, the nation's only independent ratings agency that regularly evaluates the relative safety of U.S. banks and credit unions, has warned that 4,243 banks and credit unions could be vulnerable to failure. So among them, 1,210 institutions, or 12.8%, got a red warning flag signaling a risk of imminent failure, while over 3,000 received a yellow warning flag indicating a risk of failure in a financial crisis or recession, which we know we're entering into a recession. Even the mainstream talking heads are talking about it. In some, 45% of all banks and credit unions were deemed vulnerable. So Dallas Brown, who we're going to listen to a snippet with him, their CCO says the underlying financial weaknesses in the U.S. banking industry are widespread, and the FDIC's newly expanded guarantee of all deposits does nothing to protect shareholders and bank holding companies who could still lose most or all of their money. Moreover, if the U.S. Treasury cannot even pay its own bills, it could be hard pressed to cover the expanded liabilities of the FDIC. So, taking those words, now I'm going to pull up this clip from Glenn Beck interviewing this guy, and then we can kind of dive into this together. So here's a short clip I'm going to play for everybody.
Much about me, but I tend to think that we are running a shell game with our banks and our Federal Reserve and our central banks and our Treasury. And I think we've done such damage to our banks, and they are just printing money to keep everything looking like it's okay. So that's my point of view, so you know where I'm coming from, and I want you to correct me, and enlighten me if you have anything better to say. I have not heard of Weiss ratings before, but I know you guys have been around for about 50 years, and in the last bank crash, I think you guys were the ones leading the way saying, trouble. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so we did. So I can get to both your points really quick, but let me just jump in and tell you who Weiss is and what we've been doing. So this analysis we did isn't something that we just did one time. We rate banks and many assets, stocks, insurance companies, bonds, and crypto daily. And so we see the movement that happens based on liquidity of banks, capitalization, stability. And so we're very vigilant. Our analysts are very vigilant about this. And so Weiss has been doing this. They started rating banks in 1971.
Okay.
And so Martin Weiss is the founder, and his father, actually back in 1930, his name is Irving Weiss. He predicted the failure of the Bank of the United States. And so that's where the catalyst of this came. And so in 1971, he got together with his son, and they started rating banks for safety for consumers. And so we rate every bank. And so it's not just banks, it's also credit unions. And so in 2008, we named in advance warning all the major banks that failed during that financial crisis.
I mean, you were I think the only guys that said Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers are going.
Yep. So it was like weeks before Bear Stearns, and it was like 100 and some odd days before Lehman Brothers that we announced that they're gone. Like it's an end game with them. But
so I think this kind of helps frame this, because now going back to just pulling the article, now that you see this kind of a company, the fact that they are saying, I mean, I don't know how this isn't like headline news, right? Because this is significant. The fact that they're saying that 45% of all banks and credit unions were deemed vulnerable, right? With 12.8% on the risk of imminent failure. And then over 3,000 risk of failure in a financial crisis or recession, which we're entering into. I mean, this just seems like a pretty, I'd say, dire prognosis of the banking industry. But Kirk, I want to get your thoughts on it.
Well, it is dire, and Martin Weiss is brilliant. I mean, they take, literally, imagine the time it takes to analyze every single bank, right? Number of assets, number of liabilities, how much derivatives do they have? What are their percentage of non-performing loans, right? How much do they have in mortgages? How much do they have in stocks, right? All of that. I mean, I've been using them and their services since the early 2000s. I mean, they've been around for a long time. I mean, they're really, really great research-oriented company. Now, how appropriate for today that you found that research article, because A, they're very good at what they do, but B, back when we were using them, banks have always been a little bit precarious, but not like they are today, right? Because ever since the Fed changed the reserve requirement to zero, banks don't have to have any money on hand. So therefore, the financial stability of the banks is of utmost importance. If you think that your cash is safe, your checking accounts are safe, you might want to guess again, right? Because those numbers, what was it? I didn't write them down. 4,200 and how many banks are basically at like terminal velocity? I mean, seriously? I mean, this is not a good foreshadowing or leading indicator for what's coming with the banks, especially when they have zero liquidity by the Federal Reserve's own basically rules and regulations. So here's where when we go back, we start connecting some dots here. It makes it even more important. The video that you and I watched on this show of the FDIC meeting, that was captured on video, where they're saying there's unintended consequences. The public cannot know about this, right? What can't the public know about? What was the gist of that conversation back in December of last year? Well, it was multi-pronged, is what we found out. Number one, that banks have no capital on hand. They didn't want to have a run on the banks. Why didn't they want to have a run on the banks? Because they have no capital. But B, if there is a run on the banks, the FDIC is so underinsured. As of today, when we first did that, it was about 1.38% of all assets were actually insured. 1.38%. Forget about the $250,000 threshold. Well, today it's worse because people have been pulling money out of stocks and bonds, putting it into their safe haven cash accounts, while the M2 money supply is deteriorating. It's diminishing because the government's pulling money out of the system. People are putting money into banks thinking that's the safe haven investment. No, it's not. Banks invest in the same thing that you and I do: stocks, bonds, companies, real estate, right? Same thing that you got out of, they're actually investing in. But today, it's about $17 trillion covered by not $125 billion anymore, because they had to use a lot of that to get out of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, Silvergate, some of those things. So it's less than $125 billion that they actually have on hand. But let's just say it's $125 billion. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. To cover $17.5 trillion of deposits, checking, savings accounts in America, that's 0.7% of all assets in America are actually covered by FDIC. So you've got two horrible Hydra arms coming out of this creature, right? Number one is banks are completely undercapitalized and underfunded. Number two, so is the FDIC, your insurance on it. So this is why Weiss Research had said, okay, we've got 4,200 and whatever that number is of banks in the critical stage, kind of ready for a bank failure. And you know what? Their research showed what was going to happen with Bear Stearns as well. This group knows what they're talking about. And this is why you and I have been shouting this from the rooftop for months now. There are more bank failures coming. They're undercapitalized. It's just math at this point, right? It's simply just math. And so what we do for all of our clients, right? We take information like this and we start to strategize a solution to get out of harm's way. General rule of thumb: if something's coming down, get out of it as soon as you can. If something's going up, get into it as soon as you can, right? That's how you protect and preserve. Now, different times in history, the things that you should get out of change and the things that you should get into change, right? Like during the Trump years and Reagan years, well, good grief. With lowering interest rates, lowering taxes, creating jobs and people's wages going up, it made sense to be in the stock market as one of the safest investments you could have had, but not now. Today, it's completely opposite. It's like, I wouldn't touch the stock market with 1,000-foot pole because it's toxic, because people's wages are coming down, and everything that you and I talk about week after week after week is actually happening. We're not talking about it like it's some kind of a theory moving forward. We're talking about it, and it's happening right now. So bank failures, and I'm not in the game of making predictions, but yet I'm going to make a prediction. We're going to see a lot more of them, a lot more. And Weiss would say there's over 4,200 banks that are primed for failure. Right? And I don't know how many we get. All I know is that we're going to have more. And the next one, is it going to be a big one? Is it going to be a top 10 bank? We got really, really close with First Republic. That was top 14 bank in the country. So to people to think, oh, too big to fail, JP Morgan, Chase, it's going to be all right because they're buying up all the medium banks. They're buying all up the medium banks with tons of debt.
Exactly.
Right? That's what they're buying. And here's the thing, as a smart business person, you're one, I'm one, right? I would never pay a penny for somebody else's debt. I would pay a penny for somebody else's assets, right? You should never, as a business person, buy people's debt. You should only buy their assets, right? So when you look at what UBS did and you pull back the sheets on this nasty thing, when they bought Credit Suisse, people thought, wow, they saved the contagion from spreading to Europe. But if I were a UBS shareholder, I'd be so upset because they paid $3.9 billion for what?
A bunch of debt.
Well, they have like 37. No, what do they have? They have $3.7 trillion in assets, in checking savings accounts. That's a lot for a bank. But they also have over $37 trillion worth of debt, tenfold what they have, 10 times as much as what they have in deposits, they have in debt. So what UBS just did, they paid $3.9 billion for $37 trillion worth of debt. In what world does that make sense?
In a clown world, right?
In clown world, where McCarthy and Biden just passed this deal that said, hey, only in political America does it make sense to add more debt to get rid of debt. In that world, maybe it makes sense, but that's not a real world.
Exactly.
That's a world where everything's about to collapse.
Exactly. Well, and so for folks that are watching or listening and are thinking like, okay, what about my local bank? I sort of walk through how the Weiss ratings works. It's actually really interesting how they've done this. So the website is weissratings.com. It's WEISS ratings. And so what you can do, so in the top right here, I'll click on this yellow bar here. This is showing the nearly 2,000 banks that are in a C rating, which I think represents that 45% that are very vulnerable. You can come in. So say your bank is the first community bank in Sherrod, Illinois. So you go on, you can click on your bank, and it will tell you the leverage ratio, the return on assets, total assets, capital, total deposits, and net income. So this bank, their net income is $132,000, with $67 million in assets, and the return on assets is less than 1%. It's a C plus. Now, I can't make sense of those numbers in the way that you could, but let's just go back to that homepage again. Let's click on the E, which is showing these are the ones that are like red. So here's one, Rockhold Bank in Bainbridge, Ohio. Not sure where that's at. Which is their return on assets is 0.31%. And so it actually gives you this details and see. So I think for people that are watching, weissratings.com, and this is a really easy way. I've already gone in there and looked up all the different banks. I use a couple different banks that I've used. And thankfully, like one was like a B plus, one was a B minus, but it's already, I've already been taking, moves against this and pulling things out and putting them into other things. But anyway, I just thought this was interesting because this is like a very practical way for folks to understand, because I see questions all the time. They say, are credit unions better than banks? Well, go check out the rating of your local credit union. But I think it's also important to understand the broader picture of this, which is that they're saying that 45% of banks and credit unions are, if we enter into a recession, which we know that's where things are headed, are at a high risk of failure. And that's concerning to me, because to me it's kind
Yeah.
of like, even if 10% were a high risk of failure, that would be enough, I would think, to cause massive damage in the banking industry. But if nearly 1 in 2 banks are at risk of failure over the next year, I just feel like that we're just seeing the beginning of this.
I think that we are. And so I'm putting together a strategy for my team to help everybody analyze these numbers if they were to go to Weiss Research and find their bank, because we know what to look for. I mean, this is what I do. I've got a PhD in this kind of stuff as to what causes banks to fail. I mean, generally speaking, just dumb it down as much as I can, when their investments stink and their withdrawals are greater than their deposits. I mean, that's what causes a bank to fail, right? So you start to dig into the number. What is their number of non-performing loans? What is the number of their assets? What about the liabilities? What about the leverage debt that they have and their securities mix? Do they have securities? Do they have bonds? Do they have real estate, or do they invest in companies? What does the bank or credit union invest in, right? So this is the kind of thing that I'm putting together for our team to actually help all of the viewers navigate through the madness because our goal as wise and prudent investors is to be in the right place at the right time, navigate through a crisis with a smile on your face, knowing that there is a solution. And you and I have talked about this before because of the faith that we have, that we all share, and what's in our hearts, right? And this is what makes me sad about America right now, is we're consumed and gripped with fear, focused on the storm rather than on the solution, right? So, for example, I mean, this is just a horrible example, but I have a feeling there's thousands of people all over the country doing the same thing. So, what we focus on at our firm is buy low, sell high, maximize the number of ounces of silver you can get, right? You only can do that with bullion, right? Because key to wealth, A, be in the right place at the right time. Second key to wealth, don't overpay for your stuff, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. But I talked to, in the last 2 weeks, 5 clients. They sent me their invoices from other firms that they have done with in the past, or they were a couple weeks out from being able to talk to me, and they just said, I thought the world was going to end on June 1st, right? And so I went with another company. Okay, here's an example. Actual real numbers, $1 million investment, paid $71.15 an ounce for silver and paid $3,700 an ounce for gold. It's like, what? Are you joking? I mean, silver's 23 something dollars an ounce.
So they paid $1 million for maybe $300,000 in precious metals. I mean,
yeah,
that's
their portfolio. Their portfolio shrunk by almost 70% overnight. Because, and here's the thing, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. I've never seen a client ever recover from those semi-numismatic, semi-rare, collectible type coins. If you're a collector, fine. But most, like 99.999% of the people that I talk to, they're not collectors. They're not buying something just to hang it on the wall, like your grandma's thimble collection or plate collection, right?
Or stamps.
This isn't or stamps. This is an investment. You're going to sell it at some point, and you never recover from those excessive premiums. Client number 2 that we helped get out of this madness, they had gone with a company that they heard on another show, and they thought it was reputable, but they paid $123 an ounce for silver. 123. This was last week, right? It's like, I don't even care when it was. I wouldn't even care if it was in 2011 when silver went through their big, huge explosion and went from $12 to $48 an ounce in 120 days. Not even then should somebody have paid $123 an ounce, because silver was 48. But the reality is right now, silver's less than $24 an ounce, which means you should be able to get a 1 ounce round for less than $30 an ounce. Don't pay 120. That's a jip. It's the jip of a lifetime that you will never, ever, ever recover from, right? And so,
and I was surprised, I'll say, Kirk, because I don't want to name names, but you told me which companies that these were, the two companies that you're talking about that you saw the actual receipts from, I was surprised. They weren't some small little company that I've never heard of. These were both probably two of the bigger companies that I see a lot of conservative shows promoting. And my jaw hit the floor, because I agree with you. It's like they're, if silver is $24 an ounce and they're paying 123, they're paying almost $100 premium per ounce, which,
Yeah.
it's robbery. That's insane.
It's robbery. And I don't know how they sleep well at night. And it's not just two companies. I've got 5 right now in front of me that I'm looking at their invoices and trade records from the trade. It's like, what? I'm just floored. And I don't know how people can sleep at night, right? This is that bad. And there's always some kind of a song and dance. Oh, these are older and rare, and you're going to get a double play on your investment as silver runs out and you can't get these older rare things anymore, and it's going to multiply. It's like, no, back in the day, prior to the year 2000, maybe that was the case, because people, if they wanted leverage on their account, they would buy some of these things, or there's very few of them. The world has changed. Since then, nobody cares. If somebody wants leverage, they're going with cryptocurrency now. The old rare coins, the things that have stories, never, ever, ever. I don't think ever again. Just one guy's opinion, but I've got 29 years of experience in this industry, right? But I don't ever see that, which is why we only will allocate into safety and low cost bullion, because I don't care. The only person that really cares about the story is the first person who buys it. When you sell it again, it's like, well, that was important to you, but not to me. I just want ounces of silver, right? So here's the thing. Don't believe the song or dance. Don't believe that collectability and scarcity and rarity. And that comes with a higher premium, and it also comes with a higher commission, right? And if that defines what you want, if you want a collectible to pass on to heirs for the next generation, then that's great. You should go with one of those companies, right? Because I don't sell that garbage. I won't. And I shouldn't say it's garbage if that's what you want for a collection. It's like, fine. But for an investor, which is what I'm concerned about, I'm concerned about protecting and preserving people's portfolios to navigate through this crisis that we're in economically, politically, geopolitically. Be in the right place at the right time and don't overpay for your stuff. Those kind of stories absolutely break my heart, because these are people. They're real people with real stories, with a lifetime of blood, sweat, and tears, working, saving up for their retirement. And they were just robbed. They were stolen from, right? And that disgusts me to the core of who I am.
You and I both. So, Kirk, I know that we've got to kind of wrap up here, and you've got something, I've got something as well. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on. I really always enjoy this. I want to encourage folks to go do a little investigation on your bank, but also reach out to Kirk and his team. Look, I'm not going to throw out this invitation on your behalf, but I'd say, look, if you just made a big purchase like that with a different company and you're concerned, I would say give Kirk's team a call. Not that you're going to try to look over everything and try to vet everything, but that's a lot of money. In my opinion, the person that spent $1 million on that, someone just stole $700,000 from them, and stole $700,000 from their future, from that person's grandkids. For me, I could not sleep at night. So anyway, so folks, if you want to talk to Kirk, talk to his team, best website to do it, goldwithseth.com, 720-605-3900. If you want to call them, again, goldwithseth.com, fill out the little form there, or 720-605-3900. And again, honestly, look, this is why I work with you, because I know how you structure this. I used to be in the jewelry industry. I used to be in the precious metals business. I know what kind of shenanigans happen. This is why I'm so confident when someone says, even with my mom, say, who do you recommend? It's like, Kirk. I trust Kirk. You've got a good heart. You've got good values. So anyway, Kirk, thanks again. It's always great having you on. Look forward to you being back on again next week.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Seth. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.